Welcome to our discussion of Congress. This is probably one of our denser lectures in this class just because the content does span a few different topics in terms of congressional representation and congressional elections. So if you feel like breaking it in half, that might be wise. Otherwise, sit tight and we'll get right through it. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the nuts and bolts of Congress. How does it work? What are some of the key features? And how can we differentiate the two branches? And in fact, that's where we'll start. There are some features of each chamber that are different. So remember, we have two chambers. If you remember back to our discussion of the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, that was one of the defining features of our convention, was that we would end up with two chambers. The House of Representatives, which is apportioned by population, and we currently have 435. In fact, it's capped there, for now at least. And the Senate, which is 100, two per state. Those are statewide offices. And the House of Representatives have districts within each state. There are so many districts that are congressional districts. The presiding officer of the House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House. That is also the third person in line for the presidency in what's called the chain of succession. So for some reason, the president and the vice president cannot serve. The Speaker of the House is the next in line. This is someone who is the leader of the majority party and is elected by party members in the chamber. On the Senate side, technically, the presiding officer is the Vice President of the United States, though it is rare that the Vice President of the United States actually goes down and presides over the Senate. Not completely uncommon in terms of big votes and things of that nature, but certainly not the day-to-day norm. In that case, it would fall to the President pro tempore of the Senate. The organizational structure. In the House of Representatives, the parties are heavily involved in how the House runs, including who is in charge of certain features of the House, what legislation is introduced and passed, and the rules and systems in place. In the Senate, it is true, especially as of late, that the parties are involved, but there is a sort of different sense of how things run in the Senate, that people can be a little more independent and a little more collegial across party lines than they can in the House. So there's more room for things like negotiations and compromise. In each chamber, there are different ways in which legislation actually gets made. You may have heard the term how the sausage gets made. In the House of Representatives, there's a very wide-ranging whip system, which is an informal system of party control. We'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. But that's the way the party effectuates control over its members. In the Senate, more bipartisan action occurs because it's smaller, and senators have more political independence than members of the House. So those are some key differences. Let's talk about some of those formal and informal links. There's two ways you can think about how Congress is organized. One of those ways is the whip system. This uses formal and informal linkages to connect party leaders to party membership in each branch of Congress, in particular in the House of Representatives. So people are named as whips or assistant whips for various things, for geographic areas, for demographic areas. So there's different whips for different caucuses, like the Latino caucus or the Black caucus. And what this does is it keeps members in line on issues of importance. It tells members what the party leadership is thinking and how they urge people to vote. But they also do other things, like they take counts of where people stand. So if an important bill is coming up for a vote, the way that they know how they're probably going to vote in terms of the entire party is because they're able to do these counts. And they can also pass along information both ways, right? Representatives can pass information up to party leadership through the whip system as well. So that's one way in which Congress is organized internally. Another way is the committee system. Committees are smaller bodies within each chamber that really do the real work of vetting legislation, actually marking it up, making amendments to it, and holding hearings. And you may have seen some of those hearings on TV. Certainly, if you watch C-SPAN, you'll see a lot of them. But you may have seen them in different news stories, especially if you watch cable news. Because that's a lot of times when you hear Congress ask questions of so-and-so today, that's going to be a committee. There are different types of committees and different ways you can split them up. One way is based on permanence. So there are standing committees and there are select committees. Standing committees are ongoing, meaning so every 2 years there's a new Congress because the House of Representatives turns over every 2 years. And there will be new committees each time, but it's the same committee. So it's always the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. It just has new members. Select committees are shorter term, specific issues that are brought up and then usually go away. However, some, if they stay on for long enough, can become standing. So one of the examples of this is Homeland Security, which became a formal committee. So that's one way of kind of breaking down or categorizing committees. Another is based on prominence. There are some committees, and they're different for the Senate and the House, that are more prominent than others. So in the Senate, the Judicial Committee or Judiciary Committee is one that hears when there's a Supreme Court justice that is nominated. They're the ones who do the hearing for that. Also, lower court judges, they do the hearings for that. So sometimes they become a little more prominent in certain times. But certainly foreign relations committees in the Senate and then appropriations committees or any kind of money committee in the House is going to be more prominent than, say, some of the more housekeeping type committees that just don't get the same coverage. So there's different ways to think about the committees, but in whole, you can think about them as smaller versions or smaller bodies within Congress itself. And then, of course, there are subcommittees that come off of those as well. So when we're talking about committees, one question you may have, and one question political scientists have had, is why do certain members get put on certain committees? And the reason why they ask that is because the party in charge of Congress, the one that has the majority, is the one who largely gets the say on who's on what committee. And there's kind of two theories as to how this works. One is the distributive theory. The idea that you want to choose committees for your members or have members choose committees for themselves that are relevant to getting reelected. This might mean that those committees can provide grant money to a certain area. So if you live in a high-tech area, maybe you'll want to be on a technology-related committee so that when a grant goes out, you can claim credit for having gotten a grant for your area. Another is the informational theory. The idea that committees exist to gather information and representatives from some districts have relevant information based on that district's profile. So the idea is that, again, if we're talking about the same theoretical member of Congress, if they work in a high technology area, maybe they should be on a technology committee not because they can get something for their district, but because they can give information to Congress based on who's in their district, what industries are there, what people are there, etc. So it's something that is good for Congress in terms of its information gathering and legislative role. Neither one of these is the right answer. These are just two theories that have developed over time. So, of course, we have to talk about how a bill becomes a law. And I will link in here the infamous How a Bill Becomes a Law song that many of you may know from Schoolhouse Rock. I will also put up a video that kind of talks about all the things that were left out of that initial video, because How a Bill Becomes a Law is certainly a little more complicated than what we see in that particular video. So let's get started and talk a little bit about how a bill actually becomes law. So as you can see here, There are basically 8 steps, and that seems very straightforward. However, it's far from straightforward. If you notice, there's a reason why step 1 is really dark and step 8 is really light. That's because as you go through these steps, bills die along the way. In fact, most are even lucky to make it to step 1. So as we go through all of these steps, I want you to be thinking about the fact that most never make it to this final spot and die each step along the way. Because this is a difficult process, and it was meant to be difficult. There was this notion that slowing down legislation would ensure that only good legislation got passed. You can judge that for what it is, and how it's worked in terms of what you see Congress doing. But this is how Congress is supposed to work, by and large. So the first few steps. The first step is that you have to have a bill that is introduced by a sponsor who is a member of Congress. Now, I know this sounds simple, but a lot of people think the president can initiate legislation. That is actually not the case. The president can't initiate legislation. The president can ask a member of Congress to do that, but they have to actually find a member of Congress to be willing to do that. So you need to have at least one sponsor in one chamber, meaning the Senate or the House. And really, what you want is broad support. You want multiple co-sponsors, preferably bipartisan co-sponsors, but at least a wide variety of co-sponsorship, so you can show that your bill has a lot of support. Many bills never leave the ground, so someone may announce, I'm going to introduce a bill that does X, Y, and Z. Well, they might do that, but they might not, because it just might not have support. Steps 2 through 3. Most bills get introduced, nothing happens. So if you make it to step 2 and 3, well, good for you. Step 2 is that the bill is referred to a committee. What that means is that the Speaker of the House, or in the Senate, the Majority Leader, will refer it to an appropriate committee, and sometimes appropriate committees, based on the subject matter of the bill. So they can hold hearings, they can change the language, they can determine whether it should move forward, and that's step 3, which is committee markup. However, that's all at the discretion of the committee chair. If the committee chair never wants to deal with the bill, the committee chair never has to deal with the bill. So if you are in the minority party, it is very hard getting legislation through. It is an uphill battle, to say the very least. This is even more true when you have this process of multiple referrals, which is what I spoke to earlier about being assigned to multiple committees. So if you have a bill that deals both with some form of, let's say, technology, and so it has to go, let's say, to the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. But it also has to go to Agriculture because it has an agricultural component as well. Those are 2 major committees. And then they can get referred down to subcommittees within those committees as well. So these things have to go down to the subcommittees, back up to the main committee, and then be both referred back out to the floor by all relevant committees. This can take a ridiculously long time, and so most of the time, since Congress rolls over every 2 years and everything starts fresh, bills don't make it through this process in time. But let's say you do. The next step then is to the Rules Committee. After the initial committee or committees approve of the bill, the Rules Committee decides in the House of Representatives now. Let's stick with the House of Representatives for the rest of this example. How the regular body should vote on it. So sometimes what this means is that there's limited debate, there's only a certain amount of amendments, only certain people can make amendments, or only certain types of amendments are made. But this is heavily controlled by the Speaker of the House, who is the leader of the majority party, and this committee is used to shape policy. So if you don't want to have debate about a bill, you just kind of want to get it through, you make it so that there's no debate, or maybe limited debate, and then there's an up or down vote. If you want to stall something out, maybe you give it unlimited debate, unlimited amendments. So the Rules Committee is kind of a place at which you can clamp down on action on a bill, or you can kind of open it up, and opening it up often means stalling it. So in the Senate, the Rules Committee does not serve the same function. However, the Majority Leader essentially does the same thing. But we'll talk about some differences in a minute. So, you've made it through the Rules Committee. Then you can go back to the floor. Remember that thing where you were introduced, maybe months or years ago? Returns can only be discussed in the manner that the Rules Committee allows them to be discussed in. So you have to abide by those rules. And the first step is actually approving the rule. So the first step that is voted on is the rule, and then the second step is the actual bill. But it's up to the Speaker of the House as to when to schedule, and this is same for the Senate. It's up to the Majority Leader when to schedule it, which means if they don't want to schedule it, they don't have to schedule it. There is something called a discharge petition to get it out of committee and back onto the floor, but those are largely unsuccessful. So if the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader does not want it on the floor, guess what? Not coming to the floor. So you've approved it in one chamber. Hooray! You have to now go to the other chamber. That's step 6. So once you go to one chamber, you have to actually get it approved in another chamber in the exact same language, down to every little word, every little comma, semicolon, period, etc. If you do not have 2 bills that are passed that match exactly, there are a few ways of dealing with that, one of which is that the House can approve the Senate's version or the Senate can approve the House's version. That requires another vote in the chamber that's accepting the other chamber's version. Another way of doing this is going to conference committee. They can actually have a committee of members of both chambers that come up with a compromise version, and then both chambers have to vote on that and approve that bill. In other words, you need the same exact product being approved by both chambers. Then, and only then, do we get to step 8, where a bill goes to the president. And the president has essentially 2 options. The president may sign the bill, or the president can veto the bill. And Congress can override the veto by a 2/3 vote from both chambers. This is rare, but it has happened. It only happened to President Obama once, but it happens to presidents from time to time. That said, there is something called a pocket veto that we'll talk about when we talk about the presidency. So let's talk about some changes over time, because Congress certainly doesn't operate the same way it did back when the Founding Fathers were members of Congress. And when we're doing this, we're going to largely focus on the House of Representatives, and then I'll kind of go back to the Senate at the end and tell you some differences. So the House of Representatives is the bigger and more democratic, and I say that with a small d, not meaning the party, but the notion of democracy, more democratic institution. Political parties have shaped the way that the House works in a variety of ways. And this process of shaping how the House of Representatives works can be described through the process of centralization or decentralization. So I want to explain those concepts for you and actually have them mean something, because they can be a little bit confusing. So the notion here is that power is centralized. Centralization is happening when power is in the hands of the Speaker of the House. That means that one person, and by extension, one party, controls how the entire process works. So we've talked about the Rules Committee, and this is particularly where this happens, is that the Rules Committee acts as an arm of the Speaker in order to stop legislation that they don't want to proceed, or to push legislation forward that they want to happen, and maybe forward in a way that is faster than it would otherwise happen. When this happens, that's centralization. That's when Congress is centralized. There's also decentralization. Decentralization means that power is dispersed amongst the entire body. And largely this is done through committee heads. So committee heads become powerful in their areas of subject expertise, but that's only that area. So each committee head has power, and usually this happens by seniority. So those are the most senior members, and it's more by figureheads amongst the party and even in the opposition party than it is in the Speaker of the House. So centralization and decentralization, when you're thinking about those terms, think largely about whether power is held by the Speaker of the House or whether power is held by committee chairs and regular members of the branch. So I want to roll through some of the historical developments, and there's a lot filled in here on these slides. I'm not going to touch on every little thing, but I want you to get a sense of how this happens over time. And largely what happens is that centralization happens and then decentralization follows. And it kind of is like this tug of war throughout history that we have seen in the House of Representatives. And the first era of centralization was after the Civil War. The Speaker of the House was still fairly powerful at this time, but was kind of not as powerful as the President. And that was not historically the way things were. The Speaker of the House used to be the most powerful political actor in the country. So after the Civil War, there was an attempt to re-centralize power in the hands of the Speaker so that the Speaker could appoint committee chairs, name members to committees, punish party members who got out of line, etc. And importantly, the Speaker chaired the Rules Committee himself, meaning he decided essentially what came to the floor and under what type of vote, with large power, so not likely to be challenged by anybody. Eventually, this became too much for members of Congress, and they revolted. Peaceful revolt, but they revolted nonetheless. And that's called Cannon's Revolt, and it happened in 1910, and that led to the era of decentralization. From 1910 to the 1960s, we had an era of decentralization where a rules change was made that removed entirely the Speaker from the Rules Committee and made it from members of that committee were elected by the entire body of the House. And committee chairs largely held the power. Seniority governed positions on those committees, and usually the most senior member of the governing party was the chair. And it stayed this way for a long time. And a lot of times when people say, oh, when Congress used to work, well, this is the era they're talking about. And depending on who you talk to, Congress used to work for certain people. Because senior members of those committees largely were unresponsive to certain issues of the day. So when civil rights legislation was proposed initially, it got stopped by members of Congress who were in those senior committee chair positions. And of course, younger members of the parties did not like this. So if you are knowing that this cycle is a tug of war, you're probably looking for some type of revolt. And that happened in a few ways, but one of the ways was that the Democratic Party itself changed. The Republican Party too. But because the Democratic Party was in control in this era, that's largely what matters here. Reforms within the Democratic Party led to differences in the membership of the party. So people who were Southern Democrats and rejected civil rights legislation became Republicans. And I'm generalizing here, but this is the trend. And people in the typically in the Northeast and New England who were more conservative, more liberal, Republicans ended up becoming Democrats, and you had this shift in how the parties were aligned. And this is why the Democratic Party today does not look like the Democratic Party of the early 1960s or late 1950s, and same for the Republican Party. Rules changes meant that people who were chairs of committees did not necessarily get those jobs by seniority, that there was a measure of how loyal you were to the party and the party platform. And so a lot of senior members got mad about this, and they either switched parties or they left Congress altogether. So this is a sort of a move towards centralization, but not a full move. There was still a lot of power in committee chairs' hands. It's just how those committee chairs were appointed changed. That all changed in 1994 when the Republicans had what is known as the Republican Revolution and the Contract for America, or with America rather, and Newt Gingrich leads the Republicans to power. And this is an era of heavy, heavy centralization. Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker of the House. All of the committee chairs are selected not based on seniority, but based on loyalty to the party and loyalty to the Newt Gingrich run campaign in 1994, too. So if people were kind of not on board with that, they lost their chair positions. And there were a lot of people that were mad. The party would issue draft legislation for its members to pass through their committees with very little discussion or debate. And essentially, within the first 100 days, several bills came up for a vote because of this policy of centralization and kind of a rushed stamp of approval of the party. Well, as you can imagine, Democrats claimed foul. It's what you do when you're out of power. And eventually, they did win back the House and the Senate. The Democrats, led by Nancy Pelosi in 2006, took back the House and claimed we're going to reform it. And they did a little bit, but not entirely, because they also wanted to get things done as well. And they noticed that that was easier when the power was centralized. So much of the system is still centralized today. It's a little less centralized than 1995 era. However, it is more centralized than 1910 to 1960s. So when we say, well, things used to have more debate, that's true, they did, in many ways, but not always, depending on the subject matter. The Senate changed in similar ways, but not entirely, because the Senate is generally a different body. They're more collegial, they're more stately, and there's a little more room for bipartisanship, so you see that often. However, there are some changes that have happened over the years that are worth noting, because they definitely shape the way the Senate works. So pre-1970, there were certain norms in the Senate that did not exist in the House. One of those is apprenticeship. Junior senators with lesser experience, so first or second term, studied under senior senators and deferred to their seniority. They didn't come right out of the gate with their own agenda. They didn't come with draft bills on day one. They kind of studied the job for a little bit, co-sponsored some things, served on some subcommittees, but largely did not join the Senate to shake things up on day one. That has certainly changed. We have many senators who on day one have their own agendas, their own legislative staff, and are ready to work. Legislative work is another. Senators were master legislators, and they carefully crafted their own legislation from start to finish. And this coincides with the next one, which is specialization. They often had areas in which they specialized. If you are going to be writing your own legislation, it's easier if you have, as a party, a couple of members who deal with foreign affairs, a couple of members who deal with agriculture, a couple of members who deal with the judicial branch, etc., so that you have people who are specialists in that area, and not everybody has to know everything. Those things have largely started to change and shift more towards staff doing the legislative work and people being generalists rather than specialists. The last two are kind of norms about how the Senate functions as a body. The first is courtesy and reciprocity. The Senate used to be, and still is to some extent, the more collegial body, where if you disagree, the first thing you do is you go talk to the person. You don't put them on blast on television, as the kids say. But you don't resort to personal attacks straightforward. That's the type of thing that's done in the House, not in the Senate, right? That you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, within reason, and that we're courteous and polite. That has gone down significantly, although not entirely with comparison to the House. The other is institutional patriotism. Senators take pride in being the upper chamber of Congress, and they see it as kind of a job that is elevated above or higher brow than the House. You can see this with some of the older members of the Senate who've been there a long time. John McCain might be one of them, who thinks of the Senate as an important institutional actor in a way that the House is not in the same light. So having this institutional patriotism used to be the norm. As I've talked about, the 1970s brought a lot of changes, and some of those changes were to the Senate as well. In the post-Watergate, post-civil rights era, there's a lot of anti-government sentiment in general. It made it harder for senators to act like they did in the past. So they had more professional staff, more committee assignments, and just less specialization. We also have growth of the filibuster. So I'm going to link a video that explains what the filibuster is, and then another one showing how the filibuster has been essentially dismantled, except for with straight legislation at this point. And it would not surprise me if it changes even more so when we get rid of the filibuster altogether. Essentially, what the filibuster does is it makes it so that the minority party can stop debate on a bill as long as they take up space in the Senate long enough and talk long enough while debate is supposed to be going on. That's why you sometimes hear about the filibuster-proof 60, because the vote that you need to have to stop a filibuster is you need to have a certain number of votes, and so 60 is that magic number. And usually the Senate is more divided. It's usually 50-50, 51-49, etc. So 60 means that you can kind of do anything you want, but 50 is a simple majority. In recent years, we've gotten rid of the filibuster for cabinet positions, Supreme Court positions, and lower judicial appointments as well. So we don't see this happening quite as much anymore, and we do have it for regular legislation at this moment, but since the trend is to get rid of it, I wouldn't anticipate that sticking around forever. All right, now, one of the questions you should have about Congress is, why are they so awful? Because everybody hates Congress. If you can see here, Congress is largely disapproved of. Just for parity's sake, because Congress approval isn't taken at the same rate, and at least not with the same numbers all the time. In January of 2016, so previous president, we're not even talking about the current term, presidential approval rating was at 46%, and people might say, oh, that's bad, that's good. That's pretty much, between 45 and 55, that's kind of the range where presidents sit for most of their time. Congressional approval rating was at 16%. 16. If you notice on this chart, it rarely gets above 20% in the past 15 years or so, with the exception, of course, of 9/11, where right after that, congressional approval rating went through the roof with everything else for a moment. However, you should be asking yourself, why? If we hate Congress so much, how do the same people keep getting elected? Why do we keep perpetuating this? Why don't we just throw the bums out? Well, that's because we generally approve of the way that our representative is doing his or her job. So these numbers are selected. Again, this is not a poll that they take all the time. But if you look, what you can see is that those approve numbers are much higher than the congressional approve numbers. Now, let's take that one step further. Do you know their name? Do you approve or disapprove of the way the representative from your congressional district is handling her job, and you know that person's name? The approval ratings are even higher then. So if you look back here on the May 2nd, 2013 one, approval ratings were 46% for your own representative. Here they're 62. They're 62% if you know their name, which means there's something about knowing their name. There's something about knowing who your representative is that matters. So our representatives are better, and that means our own individual ones, for a few reasons. One is constituency service. Our representatives do things for individuals and businesses within their districts that gain them favor. If you have a problem with a federal agency. You can call your member of Congress to get some help. Now, sometimes they're able to help you, sometimes they're not, but just kind of having someone there as a person who can answer your call and direct you maybe in the right direction is a big help. And we have studies that show that constituency service does add, conservatively a 1 to 2% boost to someone's vote total the next election. Another is spending in district. Members of Congress try and get projects on a federal level, some sort of funding in their own district, and then they take credit for it. Visible projects within their home districts make it easier to say, oh, look, yeah, that bridge was repaired because Representative Smith helped get that done. So they're able to take credit for that. Another thing is, it doesn't matter how long someone is in Congress. Does not matter how long. They still use this same line. They are running for Congress to clean it up. Sound familiar? Sounds like pretty much every congressional ad you've ever heard. In fact, John McCain, who's been in the Senate forever, still uses that. He's a maverick, right? He's running for Congress to clean it up. He's not going to just follow along party lines. He's going to do what he needs to do. Every single politician vows to go to D.C. and change it. Few actually do. But that messaging tends to resonate pretty well. That said, members of Congress are largely responsive to the people who vote for them. They take positions that their districts would approve of, even if they're not nationally popular. And that makes sense, right? Because those are the people voting for you. Those are the people who make sure you have a job next time. So they are fairly responsive to the people in their district. And largely, when we get a largely conservative or largely liberal representative, that's because the district itself is largely conservative or largely liberal, which is why, when we get to the bottom here, districting matters. Media coverage in the district gives free PR, so if there's coffee hours, town halls, you show up at an event, that's free PR, your name's out there. It's one of those no press is bad press type of things. So name recognition goes a long way. So this is why you sometimes see political dynasties in areas where people have the same name as their father who held an office before them. So name recognition is a big thing and can help incumbents win just based on that. So let's talk a bit about redistricting and gerrymandering. If you remember, congressional districts are drawn based on population. However, those districts actually have to be drawn by someone. Soon we'll hear if the Supreme Court decides whether you can have partisan gerrymandering, but there are ways now to gerrymander that are legal and ways that are illegal. Illegal gerrymandering means drawing a district in order to dilute the vote count of a certain racial or ethnic minority. But you can do that with partisan politics as well, and many of our districts have been gerrymandered through the process of redistricting. That makes them what are called safe districts, so it's hard for the opposition party to win a seat there. What that tends to mean when we have all of these districts across the country that are gerrymandered is that we get more extreme politicians in Congress and arguably, although not definitively, less action in Congress in general. So we have kind of an open question as to whether this is legal. For a long time, the Supreme Court said that it was, or at least said there's no way we have to fix it. There are cases right now that might change that because they have challenged that notion. All right, so we have two Federalist Papers that are part of our supplemental readings this week. The first I want to deal with is Federalist 57, which is a reply to the critics of the proposed House of Representatives. Not everybody was in favor of the Constitution, and not everybody was in favor of the House of Representatives, to be sure. So the Federalist 57 deals with two large critiques, and we'll deal with those in turn. First, there was a critique that the House of Representatives would be too elitist to represent the common citizen. And this is dealt with in Federalist 57 in kind of 7 different ways, which I'll go through fairly quickly, but I want to highlight some of them for you. One of them is that it's hard to say something is elitist when they are actually chosen by the people. Sure, they might be rich people that choose them. There might be poor people that choose them, but they will represent all the people because all the people choose them. It's kind of a really odd argument, but in other words, that you're because you are elected, you won't be elitist. You're not going to act in an elitist way. The second is that social class, should not disqualify candidates. You don't need to have a high social class. You don't need to have a low social class. You don't have to be preventing either class or any class in between from being part of the branch. So you might get people that are wealthier than others in the House of Representatives, but that's true in life as well. And so that might actually be a better representation for the country. Another defense is that you are going to be eliminating bad people just by the sheer fact that they are going to be selected by their peers. So do you really want to elect someone, in other words, that you wouldn't trust with your affairs? Now, certainly, we have had members of the House of Representatives engaged in all kinds of scandal, and certainly we've had ones that we don't agree with. So I think that this argument, we can say, well, that means nothing, but think about it for a minute. If we were being logical, would we represent people that don't have our best interests at heart? And that's what the branch was intended to do. The fourth, is that representatives will feel gratitude to voters for putting them in a position of power, and so they will be more likely to represent their interests. We actually do see this happen. Because you have to get reelected every 2 years to the House of Representatives, you are likely to actually do what they want you to do in the first place. So if your district wants you to do something, you're going to do it even if you don't really want to, because they're the ones that hold the ultimate reward, which is reelection. And the next one, fifth, this follows in with that. There are frequent elections. Every 2 years is actually quite frequent. Most other countries that have parliamentary systems don't tend to have elections this frequently. So 2 years is pretty frequent. And by having frequent elections or re-elections, you can fix a bad decision. You put someone in, the person turns out to be a complete dud. Guess what? You don't have to vote for them the next time around. So frequent elections is one guard against this that the Federalists say is baked into the system and makes the House of Representatives a good thing. Sixth, they also have to live under the laws they pass. So even if they want to pass laws that change how certain types of property are dealt with or wealth or anything like that, they have to live under them as well. So they're not going to be likely to pass something that is elitist in the way that, oh, it's good for you, but I don't have to deal with it. No, they have to live under the laws too. So this isn't like a monarchy where the king doesn't have to live under the same law as everybody else. And finally, and this one might be the hardest to believe, the Federalists have a lot to say about Republican honor, and the Anti-Federalists did too. But they say that when all else fails, people who are called to public service will have this Republican honor. And this is lowercase r, Republican, not meaning the political party, but the notion itself, that they are going to take their job as representative very seriously, and therefore they won't do anything that jeopardizes it or is acting in bad faith. We know that sometimes this doesn't work. One could argue all the time, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the strongest of those factors. So the next critique that it is dealt with is that too many people select the representatives, and therefore this dilutes the representation. What the Anti-Federalists were saying here is you are only going to get one representative for so many thousand people, which means that person really doesn't represent your interests. They represent kind of this weird blob of people's interests. And that's kind of a good point. And it's even probably a better point today than it was then, since the representation now is about 600,000 people, whereas back then it was probably maybe, a few thousand people. But there are some responses to this critique. The first is that this isn't diluted as much as it is in Britain. It's probably the laziest critique they have, but it is true. This is better representation than you had before, so maybe it's better to take this than nothing. The other thing they said is that some states have populous districts, that it would be unfair to have it so that only states were allowed to select the representatives, but that the district should have some say as well. They also throw in this argument that representatives that are elected by populated districts that are concentrated are no less worthy, and that has some validity to it. That doesn't mean that they aren't tied to their district, they aren't tied to the people that they represent. And then this one's kind of an interesting one. They say, well, that might be true, but, anti-federalists, you're in favor of governors, and governors represent a whole state, and whole states are bigger and more populated than tiny congressional districts, and yet you're in favor of that. You say that states should govern most affairs, so isn't that elitist? Isn't that diluting representation? And in fact, this is then better than that system for that reason. So they have some points with all of this. What to take away from this Federalist paper is the notion that there was a critique already before the Constitution was even ratified, that the House of Representatives would contain people that were too elite, that did not represent the interests of the everyday person, the everyday citizen. And as you can see from the graph that I put below, this is, somewhat a valid argument even today. If you look at the median net worth of American families versus the median net worth of members in Congress, there's a pretty big discrepancy. And of course, this is median, so we're talking about finding that midpoint, but it's still a midpoint of a population, and we can see that people in Congress tend to be far wealthier and much more likely to be a millionaire than the average citizen. And maybe there is some validity in the critiques that this is too elite of an institution to actually represent the interests of the citizenry. And then we have Federalist 39, which is an essay on whether the proposed government is actually a republic. And you might say, well, why are we even concerned with this? Well, the founders and who turned out to be the Federalists proposed this new form of government as a republic, that a republic has certain virtues and values that make it a worthy proposition. So they're trying to defend that decision here. And so they talk about the characteristics of a republic and how maybe we don't meet all of them, but we have some of them. And this was a critique that was leveled at them by the anti-federalists, saying, you're trying to start a republic, but you don't have everything you need. So first they start off by talking about what are the characteristics of a republic. And they say, listen, we understand not every republic is going to meet every criteria for a republic. So most republics aren't real republics. But what is one thing that is required? Well, one thing that you have to have is representation of the people selected by the people. In other words, you have to have power stemming from the public, flowing up through representatives who then make decisions in government. This is an absolute necessity for a Republican form of government. And Republican form of government in that way can happen through representatives. So whether that's the Senate or whether that's the House of Representatives, if they are selected in some form by the people, then that is sufficient for our needs. And then they talk about, well, what about the Confederate form? What about these claims that the Confederate form is best? Because remember, they're trying to sell this notion that the Articles of Confederacy are awful and they're not going to work. And, they have some evidence at hand that they're not working, but they still have to fight against the notion because the status quo is hard to fight. So they say that a Confederacy does have some benefits. But you're not losing those benefits here. States are still states. They are going to make distinct policy choices that are different from one another. And you still have representation of states within the federal government. How? Well, at this time, senators were elected not by the people, but by state legislatures. That happened until about the turn of the 20th century when we had direct election of senators. So these people are really the representatives of the state in the federal government itself. So that's one. The other is that the presidency is elected by state through the Electoral College. So the states really do matter here. And so we're not getting rid of everything that was good with the Confederacy, but we still have a role for the states. But we have, we're not strictly national or federal, but we're a bit of both. We're national in that we're operating on a national level, so that internationally we have a structure for people to come talk to us and us to deal with them, but also internally we have a structure so that we can share things like commerce and trade and money and etc. It's federal in that it's not purely power from the national government that flows down, but it's people that rise up and create the government. And this is going to become important as we move through some different things. And you also already saw it once in McCulloch versus Maryland that it's the people that create the federal government, just like the people that create the state governments. So the people are the linchpin here, not necessarily the form of government and how power flows down. And so Federalist 39 is really taking this on its head and showing how representation is key to having a republic, and that the House of Representatives in particular, but even the Senate, have specific special roles in securing this Republican form of government. All right, so that's it for this week. I will see you online, and check out the syllabus to make sure you are catching all of the assignments. Thanks. Bye-bye.